Good day. My name is AJ Jackson. I've been working at this company as a consultant and an analyst for a little over 32 years. My purpose for doing these webinars is to provide information to make it easier for practice owners to manage their practice and get the kind of successful practice they want. One of the hats that I want to discuss is the hat that is required to be worn to find and develop staff. It's one thing to be able to analyze the practice and figure out what you need to focus on to grow it, but then oftentimes you need to distribute those projects to staff and get them to do it. And this brings up a whole host of questions and issues. Staff oftentimes will push back or resist requests to do new things, or they don't seem to take the initiative the way that a person would like, or they tend to infight. There's all these issues that oftentimes practice owners will find when they're dealing with staff. And this oftentimes per survey can create the greatest stress for an executive. I'm here today to give you some tools to help you resolve this. In my discussions with thousands of practice owners, oftentimes we'll talk about staff, and probably the biggest issue they're trying to accomplish is how to raise a staff member's responsibility level to the point where they view the practice almost as though they own it themselves. If you can get a staff member to ascribe to that viewpoint, there's far less babysitting that needs to be done. Something as simple as there's some paper on the floor that's making the place look dirty or messy. What you want and what you expect out of the staff members is that they see it, they pick it up, and they throw it away. It is so frustrating to have to be going by a staff member and pointing out that issue to the staff member. You think they would just see it themselves. Well, if they are viewing the practice as though it were their practice, these kinds of small little issues that drive you crazy, they tend to spot and will resolve themselves, again, resulting in much less babysitting. Now, I'm picking this as a simple little example, but the idea of getting a staff member to that high of a responsibility level solves many problems in a practice. So the question becomes, how does one do that? How do you take a staff member who is a decent staff member, and how do you develop them so that they really do view the practice as almost as though they own it themselves? There are a number of different things that have to be in place to pull it off. I'm going to focus on 5 of the most important things. First, you have to be able to hire the right person, obviously. If you bring someone in who has a bad attitude and just won't change, you have someone that you can't do anything with. And it will create hours and hours of frustration for you trying to fix the person. Plus, this person can create a very toxic environment with the rest of the staff. So obviously, hiring the right person is crucial, and we're going to get into that. Similarly with training, you can take a good staff member that was hired that turned out to really to be the right staff member, but through poor training methods, make it so that the staff member is confused on how to do their job well. Now, if we're trying to get a staff member to be responsible for the whole practice, but they're struggling to be responsible for their own specific area because they don't know how to do it well, then you're asking something to be done that simply can't be done. So in addition to hiring, you've got to make sure you have a method of training. And of course, with training, the other issue is that it oftentimes is so time consuming that executives either try and cut corners, or even more importantly, they don't let go a staff member that they know they should let go of because they don't want to face the time-consuming element of training a new staff member. So then you perpetuate the wrong staff member in the practice, and that's just the worst of all possible scenarios. So being able to train the right person is also every bit as important as hiring. Third, you have to be able to correct the staff member effectively. In a lot of ways that people correct, they inadvertently create a morale problem without even knowing it. So one thing we need to discuss is what are the best methods for correcting staff. Similarly with disciplining a staff member, if you don't do it in the correct manner, you will lower the morale of that staff member and create inadvertently your own problems with staff. So knowing how to discipline effectively is also a skill that the executive needs to master. And then lastly, you need to be able to supervise staff in a way that doesn't micromanage them, but still keeps you in the loop of what's going on. And this is probably the trickiest of all the functions, and we're going to get into that one as well. So these are the 5 issues we're going to discuss: hiring, training, correction, discipline, and overall supervision of staff. So let's take these one by one. Let's start with hiring. Obviously, in hiring, the goal is to find the right person for your practice, but we need to define something so that you understand our approach on it. And to do this, I want to use a term that you may or may not have heard of. This is a term that human resources people will often use when they're describing staff. They'll call a staff member either high-toned or low-toned. So let me define what that means. When we say someone is high-toned, we mean they work because they love the job. Now, obviously, you have to pay them, but what gets them motivated and excited is the love of the work. They're solution-oriented, so if you give them a problem, they'll work to come up with a solution. They have good attitudes, and they're responsible. All right, so that we are going to call high-toned. Low-tone, by contrast, they always seem to have drama around them. Secondly, you give them a problem to solve. Not only do they not solve it, but they'll tell you why it can never be solved. And third, their attitudes aren't very good. All right, so here we have the distinction between high-toned and low-toned. So when we go to hire, the obvious candidate that we're looking for is someone who is both high-toned and has a lot of experience. However, if you've been hiring at all, you've probably quickly realized that you rarely get that combination. And sometimes, or often, you'll have to choose. So I'm going to pose you a question. Here you have a candidate who's high-toned, but they don't have much experience. And over here you have a candidate who has a lot of experience, but they're low-toned. Who would be the right person to choose? Obviously the high-toned one, because you can train the skill set, you can't train the attitude. But too often people are scrambling to find somebody to fill the position right now. And because their training methodology is so arduous, takes so long to get somebody trained, that they fall into the trap of, let me just get someone in here who has experience. And they bring into the practice people with bad attitudes that are hired simply because of the experience. This is a death knell. You have to avoid it. So the right choice then is bringing on someone with the right attitude. And this is first and foremost what we're trying to do with hiring. Experience is great, but it's the cherry on the top. So what are the problems that have to be solved when it comes to finding the person with a good attitude? When I've talked to people about their hiring experiences, universally people have 2 problems. One, they always feel like when they go to hire that the talent pool is too limited. And so they're forever having to pick the best of the worst, or it takes them forever to find a good person. And that's very demoralizing. And again, can lead to an executive hanging on to a staff member far longer than they should. The other problem that executives often run into is they will hire someone that appears to be high-toned in the interview process, only to find out that they weren't high-toned. They got fooled. So solving these 2 problems are the important point of this part of this webinar. So let's go over the first one first. Finding people, finding good people, trying to avoid this trap that the talent pool seems too low. The reason it seems too low is the way people go about hiring creates that problem. The very functions that most people do in their interview process makes it seem as though there aren't enough good staff in the world. So let's take a look at this problem and a solution to it. This problem is based upon this observation, which has been borne out by years and years of working in personnel. And that is this: how we've defined someone who's high-toned and low-toned. The issue is there's simply more low-toned people in society than there are high-toned. I would invite you to take a look at your own experience in dealing with people in the world to see if that's true for you. But let's just assume I'm correct. So we have the issue that when looking for a good employee, we've got the fact that more people you look at, more of them are going to be low-toned than high-toned. In other words, hiring is a numbers game. It's a lot like the lottery. If you want to win the lottery, you better buy more than one lottery ticket. It's the same thing with hiring. If you want to find a high-toned person or have the odds good that you will find a good high-toned person, you better interview more than just a couple of people. Now, this can create two problems because our experience is if you want to find one or two high-tone people, you have to interview upwards of 15 to 20 people. So let's talk about this problem. First, there's the issue that a lot of executives don't know how to even get 15 to 20 people to apply. You have to know what ads to put out, what to put out in the ads, where to place them, et cetera, in order to draw in a lot of applicants. If you don't know how to do that, then you're going to be right back to square one, where you're only interviewing 4 or 5 people, and it always seems like nobody's good enough. Again, you're back to trying to win the lottery by buying only one lottery ticket. So one skill set you've got to acquire is how to get the word out and where to put it so that you attract a lot of candidates. And by the way, don't make this mistake of trying to screen by resume. Some people can get 15 to 20 to 30 resumes, but in looking through the resumes, they narrow it down to 5 or 6 people. That's the incorrect method. Resumes will not tell you someone's attitude or their tone level. The only real useful information you'll gather from resumes are, one, do they job hop? Okay, if you have someone who's been doing a lot of jobs within a year or two, probably not the right candidate for you. And that's worth looking through the resumes for. And the other one is distance. If the person's going to have to travel an extraordinary distance to get to your practice, that won't last long. They'll probably not be with you for a long time period. And those two things you can objectively look at in the resumes. Outside of that, though, resumes are not useful at this stage. They're useful at a later stage, but do not use them to screen for applicants. To find someone's tone level, you have to look them in the face. So number one is the ability to attract a lot of applicants. All right, so let's take the next problem. You have now 15 to 20 applicants to interview. Well, this creates a different issue. To do the typical way of interviewing will take somebody about 10 hours to do the first round of interviews alone. Because that is so time consuming, most executives don't do it. They only select 4 or 5 people to interview, and we're right back to the same problem again. You're not interviewing enough people. So how does one get around this? How can you do this interview and interview 15 to 20 people without making it so time consuming? I'm going to introduce you to a way of interviewing that if you've never been exposed to this before, you need to think outside the box. This is not a typical interview process. What I'm going to talk to you about is what is called a group interview. And this means one person interviewing 15 to 20 people simultaneously. I'll give you a little backstory on this. I was living in Hawaii in the 70s, and I went in for a job interview. And I found myself in a group of 15 to 20 people. We're all being interviewed by this one gentleman. Brilliant idea. So when I went to work at Silken, we took this idea and we developed 7 tests. Now, the purpose of the tests is to solve that other problem I was talking about, which is sometimes you get fooled by thinking someone is high-toned at the interview only to find out they really weren't. These 7 tests are designed to tell you who truly is high-toned and who isn't. The group interview process allows you to interview all 15 to 20 people in a short period. In fact, if you do this right, to interview the 15 to 20 people, to have them all do the 7 tests, the whole process takes 1 hour. If you're willing to learn this kind of unusual way of interviewing, you'll never have hiring problems again. To that end, I will give you a little story. This is, I guess, a hiring horror story, but it had a good ending. There was a doctor I was working with some time ago who was looking for a front office person. So I taught him the group interview and the 7 tests, and off he went and did his group interview. But he had bad luck. In that large group, there wasn't anyone good. So he had to do a second round. Then he did a third round. Then he did a 4th round. By the time he was done, I kid you not, this is exactly what he told me, he interviewed 95 people. Now, first of all, I've never seen it go beyond 2 rounds before. This person's luck is so bad, he should not be allowed in Las Vegas. But the beauty to this process, even interviewing all that large number of people only took him 4 or 5 hours. And the point is, he never compromised. He found the staff member of his dreams. So if you're willing to learn this type of interview process, finding personnel will not be a problem for you again. All right. So let's move forward. You've hired a high-tone person and now you have to train them. So how does one go about training? Well, there are two primary tools that need to be in place in order to make this work. The first are what are called job descriptions, and the second are what are called training programs. Now, I need to define these because these terms get used a lot and often misconstrued. So let's start with job descriptions. In any position, there are going to be a series of functions that someone needs to learn to do the job well. So let's take the front office person. As a receptionist, she'll obviously need to learn to answer the phones. She'll need to learn to schedule. She'll need to learn to check people in, check them out. Oftentimes she has to learn to take money, etc. Now, if you were to make a list of all these functions, you'd have what is called a functions list. And this is very helpful. It lets the new staff member coming on board know exactly what they're going to be responsible for. But this is not a job description. A job description would have a detailed write-up describing how to do each of those positions, each of those functions. Secondly, a training program. A training program is a series of steps that the executive has thought through that they want the staff member to do. Want them to read this, want them to get tested on this, want them to practice this, want them to demonstrate this. In other words, they are steps that the executive has worked out so that they knew if the staff member actually did those steps, there would be no doubt that they got trained effectively. Contrary, the way most of the time it's done is we'll say, hey, Betty, come over here and show Alice, the new person, how to schedule. Now, I, as the executive, as I walk away, I'm thinking, boy, I hope Betty knows what she's doing. She hasn't shown that in a while. I hope Alice is picking it up well. I hope. In other words, we're back to uncertainty as to whether the person really got trained. So let's take a look at the two ways of going about training, the incorrect way and the correct way. So we'll start with the incorrect way. Let's create this scenario. I just hired Alice, and she is going to be my new receptionist. I'm the executive. I have to train her. So let's say today I'm going to teach her how to schedule. So typically what will happen is I'll sit her down. I'll give her some paper and a pen. Since I don't have anything in writing to describe how to do the job, I have to dictate it to her. And I have her take notes as I'm doing this. Now this brings right to mind two immediate flaws. One, this is incredibly time consuming for me as the executive. There's an hour and a half I've spent trying to walk her through what needs to be done. And because I don't train this all the time, it's not like I've thought through this and made it coherent. So I'm forever backing up and going, oh, remember 20 minutes ago I told you about this? Well, let me modify that. I forgot to mention this. So from my perspective as the executive, this is just an incredibly arduous process. For the staff member, it's even worse. They're sitting there frantically trying to write down what I've been talking to them about, trying to determine, well, which of these things that he's saying is important. Was he telling a joke there? Was he not? It'd be like this. It'd be like going to college, having no textbooks. The only way you get your learning, your education, was somebody was up front lecturing. They didn't even have lecture notes. They hadn't lectured on this subject in years. And you're in the back trying to write down what you thought was important to keep track of. How easy would this be to absorb the data? It'd be incredibly difficult, right? Well, this is what we do to staff. Versus, let me introduce you to a more effective way. The first thing I would do is I would sit down and I would give Alice her training program. Now, I want to take a second and walk you through something to make this easier to visualize. And I'm going to very much simplify this. So bear in mind, this is not reality to that degree. We're going to say there's only two things to train Alice on: how to schedule and how to answer the phones. As I said, I'm simplifying this. So her training program would have merely two sections to it. There'd be a section on scheduling and a section on answering the phones. And within each of these sections, there would be a series of steps the person would do. So I'm going to walk you through the scheduling section so you can see it. And let's say there are 4 steps. All right. So I sit Alice down and I give her her training program. I point to the scheduling section, and the first step on it says read pages 88 through 102 on how to schedule. So I give her the write-up. I put her in the corner. I tell her to come back and see me when she's done. Okay, now notice 2 things right off the bat. First, from a time management perspective, how much time did that take me as an executive? 3 seconds, 2 minutes, tops, right? From the new staff member perspective, where would she rather get her information? Me babbling at her for an hour and a half and she trying to write down what was important? Or being able to read something that was well presented, all the bullet points laid out right in front of her? Well, obviously the latter. Okay, so let's continue on the training program. She comes and finds me and says, I read it. Second step, I give her a test over what she read. Now that's interesting. Why would we give somebody a test? Well, obviously to check their comprehension, because if they didn't get it, we want to make sure they go back and review it. But sadly enough, what you're going to find when you give this test to people is universally everybody's going to flunk it. Why? Because originally they're just going to skim the material, not taking this seriously. That's fine. This doesn't mean this isn't a good candidate. What you do at this point is you simply say, go back and read pages 88 through 102 again. This time read to understand it and come and see me when you're done. Again, though, time management wise, how much time has that taken me as an executive? Very little. All right. So Alice comes and finds me, maybe a bit red-faced because I busted her the first time. She takes the test again and she passes the test. We're not looking for perfection. We just want a general understanding of the material. All right, that was step 2. Step 3, I grab a blank appointment page and a list of procedures and I schedule and she gets to watch me do it. But notice she's watching me doing it after having read the theory behind it. So it makes a lot more sense to her. Okay. Step 4. Now, by the way, this is something we do a lot of in our business, which is role playing. So I want to stop here and talk about role playing for a second, and then we'll get back to its use in training. Role playing is a long forgotten and ill-used tool in an executive's toolbox. And I'll give you an example of this. Let's say the executive realized that the problem in the practice was too many cancellations. And after digging into it, they realized what was causing it was the receptionist was hit with an objection they've never run into before, throwing that reception for a loop. So the executive creates a script to deal with that specific objection and then gives it to the receptionist. Make sure she understands it. And then walks away quite proud of himself for having done all that work. Well, this is doomed to fail. And to get you to see this, let me give you a parallel example. Let's take football. Here we have a coach who is designing some new pass plays. And then he has the new plays set up. He sits down and goes over them with the quarterback and with the receiver. Now, if he were simply to walk away at that point and say, good luck, I'll see you at the game, well, we would all look at the guy and say he's an idiot. And frankly, he wouldn't last long as a coach. What's missing? Well, practice, of course. In the NFL, a game is paid for 3 hours a week, but 6 days a week, the coach is role-playing the team. He's making them practice. I mean, there's a practice squad that they pay millions of dollars for that never get to play a game. Their sole purpose is to simulate the next opponent so that the team gets a chance to role play and drill. You're trying to create competency. So let's go back to this new staff member that we're training. The 4th step after I've done the demonstration with them is some role playing and drilling. I would give them a blank appointment page, a list of procedures, and the write-up on how to schedule, and I'd have them sit in the corner and fill it out and show it to me when you're done. I would correct it, give them another blank appointment page, another list of procedures, and we'd repeat this step over and over again until the person could effectively and quickly schedule. And then and only then do I turn them loose on the appointment book. Now, done in this fashion, look what happens. 1, very little of my time is eaten up as the executive, because the bulk of the work was being done through the job descriptions and the training exercises. Secondly, the receptionist, the new person, she gets the chance to read and reread the written material, not her scribbled notes, which, think back to college. Do you really think you absorbed anything when you looked at your notes? I know when I looked at mine, I had no clue what I was writing on. So this time the Receptionist has actual material she can look over. Plus, she gets a chance to drill and practice the skill set before we throw her in the swimming pool. All right, so here we have two methods of training. Method number one, we verbally go over everything with her and throw the kitchen sink at her and expect her somehow to pick this data up. Process two, we have job descriptions and training programs that step by step work the person through the process with minimal time having to be spent by the practice manager. Okay, everybody obviously picks issue number two, procedure number two. Now, the one problem to all of that, of course, and I'm sure you're thinking about this, is the job descriptions. Compiling those in the detail necessary so you don't have to verbally walk somebody through that is a task. And I'll tell you, in 32 years of doing this, I've never seen one doctor on our program be able to write these up in the detail necessary. They're just simply too time consuming. So years ago, we bit the bullet and did it ourselves. And to give you a sense of perspective on this, we're a large enough company so that we have people who are devoted towards it. We know what we're doing better than most people, so it's easier for us to put these together. It still took us hundreds of hours to put this 450-page job description manual together. The idea that you sitting out there on your own are going to do it, I mean, I applaud you for your effort. If I was a betting man, I would lay a lot of money down that this will stay on your to-do list forever. But if you're willing to put these job descriptions and training programs together, your training of people would be far swifter and more effective and less time consuming than you can imagine. And I'll tell you this personally. In our company, we have job descriptions and training programs for every position. It takes a fraction of the time to get a new person on board. And I've seen the same thing play out in practices all over the United States. All right, so that's training. Let's turn to correction. Why do we have correction? The person got trained. Well, they ran across something that was confusing that the training didn't pick up. So let's create a scenario and walk through this. Let's say that the new receptionist has been on board now for 4 months, but she's making some mistakes scheduling new patients, and I have to correct her. All right. Typically, the way this is done in most practices is I would sit down with the staff member, I would show her what the problem was, and I would basically review what I'd reviewed with her 4 months ago. In other words, I show her exactly what I taught her originally. And this is, well, again, in all the practices I've analyzed, this is exactly how it's done. The problem with this approach is that staff member can turn to you and say, but that's not what you showed me 4 months ago. And it doesn't even mean that she's a bad staff member. She just understood it differently. What causes this confusion? Well, I invite you to remember a game that you probably played as a kid called Gossip or Telephone, where someone whispers a phrase in someone's ear and it gets passed around a circle. And what makes the game so funny is how mangled that phrase gets. But notice, all that's passed around is indeed a phrase. Next time you play the game, tell you what, whisper into that person's ear the entirety of how to schedule and let them in turn pass it around the circle. How mangled do you think it would be? This is the biggest problem in training. It's done verbally. We somehow expect this new staff member to absorb complex information, a lot of it thrown at her verbally. I mean, this is really the height of naivete. This is why these job descriptions are so crucial. But let's go back to this problem at hand in the correction. So right now, we have a staff member who's upset at me because she's thinking, gosh, just show me the right way the first time. I'll do it however you want me to do it. I, as the executive, I'm frustrated at her because I'm thinking, oh, really? You think I showed you the wrong way the first time? Yeah, because I like doing that and seeing it mess up my appointment book. But then it gets worse because I can walk away going, well, that was rough, but I think I got Alice to see how to do it. And then here's what happens. Betty from the back comes over to Alice and says, oh, was AJ showing you how to do it that way? Wow. We haven't done it that way in a year. Here's how you're supposed to do it. And then Nancy from the front comes over and says, well, don't listen to Betty. Betty drinks too much. Here's the way you're supposed to do it. And then she shows a third way to do it. When all the dust is settled, look what's happened now. We've pulled 3 people off the job to correct Alice. That's not efficient. Secondly, Alice's frustration level is at an all-time high because she's been shown multiple ways of scheduling and she doesn't know which is the right one. And she's not corrected yet. I mean, this is the height of inefficiency. So let me walk you through a more intelligent approach. I'd sit Alice down and I would say, all right, I need to correct you on scheduling new patients because you're making a mistake. No big deal. I've printed off your appointment page. I've circled your mistakes. I want you to go back and read pages 88 through 102 again, and then come and show me how you should have done it. Now, again, time management wise, look how little time that took me as the executive. And from the staff member perspective, look at the difference. As she's reading the material again, instead of being frustrated at me, she's going, oh no, I remember reading this. Oh, I've just been doing it wrong. I'm glad they didn't fire me. So she comes and finds me, not defensive or bent out of shape, but contrite and saying, gosh, I'm sorry, I should have done it this way. And I look it over and go, right, that's right. Just do it that way. That's correction. We didn't pull 3 people off their job to correct the person. There's a standard way to do it, and everybody's doing it the correct way. But it depends on these written job descriptions in order to do this. Okay, that's correction. Discipline. Let's turn to discipline and sort this out. The 2 tools for, actually, the 3 purposes for discipline are, 1, you have a staff member who has violated policy. Okay, that happens on occasion. Somebody's a good staff member. They do something wrong. You need to discipline them. You're not going to fire them, but you do need to have a mechanism to get them to see they need to follow policy. Second purpose is to surface. If you accidentally hired a bad staff member, you need to know this as quickly as possible. And believe it or not, a good discipline system will tell you that. Third purpose, to protect you legally in case this bad staff member who you let go decides to come back to sue you. All right, the 2 main tools to have a good discipline system in place is, first of all, to have your policies in writing, and secondly, when you discipline, to document. You may not document the first time, maybe it's a verbal warning, but once it gets beyond that, you need to document, and you need to have the person sign that they have acknowledged this conversation occurred. Most people, when I've looked over their discipline system, I'd say 80% of the practices have policies in place, and 80% of the practice are documenting when they have these conversations with staff. So of all the things we've talked about, this is the thing that shows up the least as a problem. Now, having said that, there are a couple things to keep in mind. 1, the policies. When I've reviewed people's policy manuals, oftentimes they're missing a segment or a section that we call attitude policies. Let me give you an example of what I mean. I'll quote to you 3 attitude policies right out of our policy manual. Number 1, contribute to an atmosphere of warmth, cheerfulness, friendliness, caring, and competence. If you can't do it so any given time, make arrangements to have your position covered until you can. That's attitude policy number 1. Attitude policy number 2, gossip is not permitted in this practice. Attitude policy number 3, it's the responsibility of every staff member to ensure the policies of this organization are carried out. If you see a staff member violating policy, it's your job to bring it to their attention. If this doesn't resolve it, it's your job to bring it to the attention of the manager. These and others are what we call attitude policies. Most policy manuals that I look at are basically clerical. They go over, here are the hours of the week. Here's the times of the month you get paid. Here are the vacations that we honor. Here are the holidays that we honor. The problem with these policies is they aren't the ones that get violated. When's the last time a staff member came up to you and said they wanted to work on Christmas or they didn't want to get paid? No, the policies that will kill a practice are the attitude ones. It's somebody coming in bent out of shape. It's the gossip. It's the infighting that goes on. These are what are destructive to a practice. So having a policy manual that includes these attitude policies is crucial. All right. In terms of documentation, the 2 things that I've seen out more often than not is the staff member isn't signing their name. And it also helps to have a little place where the staff member can put their own version of the story. So if they go before a court of law and the judge turns to them and says, well, look, you signed this. You don't have that staff member going, yeah, but I did it because I was afraid I'd get fired. That's not what really happened. Having a place where the staff member can give their own version of the story bypasses this problem. All right, that's disciplining. So let's take a look at the last issue, supervision. This is by far the trickiest one. So let me outline the problem. If you've done your job well in hiring, you have a high-tone staff member. If you've done your job well in training, they know what they're doing. So really, you have, as an executive, only two things to do with the staff. If the staff member is performing well, let them alone. Let them do their job. Don't micromanage. On the other hand, if the staff member is struggling, you're supposed to step in and correct them or discipline them as appropriate. All well and good. The problem is, how do you know if they're being effective? You can't judge by they look busy. I mean, no staff member is going to be dumb enough not to at least look busy when the boss comes around. You also can't tell by the feedback you get from patients. I mean, it's wonderful if a patient or a client comes to you and says, wow, your receptionist is so friendly. That's good feedback, but that does not mean they're being effective. So how does one get around this? And to compound the problem, everything that is done in the practice, the owner is legally liable for. So this can create a bit of anxiety. The owner, to make sure everything is done well, typically will spot check the work that's being done. Now, the problem with this, first, it's time consuming. Second, it's starting to micromanage. And third, it's sending the signal that you don't trust the person. All right, so that's not effective. So the alternative is the executive doesn't stay on top of what's going on. And so problems can crop up and go on month after month before being detected. All right, neither of those are effective. So how does one solve this problem, which frankly has been the biggest problem I have run into in talking to executives? Well, the solution to this actually got created back in the late 1950s and has worked its way through the business community. And it's based on this interesting idea that every staff member could have a statistic or two that monitors overall how they're doing. So let's see how this would play out. Let's say the reception, well, let's look at it this way. What makes the receptionist valuable to us is she keeps a book productively filled, proactively, meaning if the phones aren't ringing, she knows what to do to keep that book filled up. So she keeps the book filled productively and keeps it free of cancellations. The result of both of these is there's a lot of patients or client coming through the practice, so the doctor has a lot of work to do and a lot of income can be generated. All right, good. Well, now we have two statistics. So let's see how these would work. Let's say the staff member, the receptionist statistics are in a good range. And you see the receptionist put Mr. Smith in the afternoon, and you would have put him in the morning. What do? Well, the good executive doesn't do anything. Why? Because the receptionist has proven objectively and statistically that she can be trusted with judgment. Why? Because the stats are in a good range. In other words, she can control the appointment book. So you let her exercise her judgment. On the other hand, if the stats are down, they tell you after just 1 or 2 weeks, better get in there, find out what she's confused about, get her corrected, verify she is corrected by looking at the stats go back up, and then back away again and let her do her job. I will tell you again, in my experience, in my career, I've managed a lot of divisions. Some of these divisions had a lot of staff in them, some not so many. But if I didn't have these individual statistics, I would have known who to work with and who, frankly, are doing a great job. And the last thing they needed was me meddling in their affairs. And by the way, these individual statistics have wide range of use in the practice. Just to mention a couple, has a staff member ever come to you and asked for a raise? Sure, it's never happened in your practice, but hypothetically, let's say it's happened. Well, the first thing you would do then is look at their statistics. You don't want to give them a raise just because they survived another year. You want to give them a raise because they're more productive. If you have these stats, it shows who truly is productive and who is not. Secondly, let's say you have a staff member, Betty, who's complaining about staff member Alice, saying, oh, Alice is doing a terrible job. She's insulting people. She's just tearing apart this front. Okay, that's just general data of which nothing is backing it up. but it leaves you with the impression that Alice is not a good staff member. Well, the first thing you go do is look at Alice's stats. And let's say her stats are in a high range. Then what we have now is a staff member who is attacking a very effective, productive staff member. So the person you would investigate, first of all, is not Alice, but Betty, the one who's attacking the staff member. And I'm sure you've seen instances where the good, productive people are being singled out by vindictive other staff. So these are just ways that these statistics can be of use for a practice owner. But the main purpose is to give you an objective way of managing personnel. All right, so those are the 5 issues: hiring, training, correction, discipline, and supervision. If you can do these effectively, you will have gotten 80-85% of what needs to be done with staff, and you will have yourself a great group of staff. If you want to discuss this anymore, take a look at how this affects in your practice, feel free to contact us. We do free analysis all the time of practices to help owners look at what's going on in their practice and single out what they need to work on. And we'd be more than happy to do that with you. The contact information is on their screen. And I wish you a productive and viable practice. And I hope you found this enjoyable and informative. Thank you very much.